All right, good afternoon and welcome to our October 17, 2014 virtual seminar series. I'm very happy to introduce to you today Zephi Francis, who is a master's student studying disaster science and management at the University of Delaware. His master's thesis discusses tornado safety education in Oklahoma public schools. As a graduate student, Francis worked as a research assistant at the Disaster Research Center and traveled to Moore, Oklahoma to interview residents about the response to an EF5 tornado that struck on May 20th, 2013. As an undergraduate student, he worked at the Disaster Research Center on numerous projects such as hurricane evacuation and sheltering, human responses to tornadoes, public health preparedness, disaster aid, and Haitian displacement to Florida following the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Currently, Zephi lives in Wilmington, Delaware. Welcome, Zephi. We're going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. I really am grateful to have this opportunity to share some of my research with you all. I have been following these talks for a few years now. I believe back in 2010, my advisor, Dr. Benegary, and his graduate student, Eric Best, they participated in a talk. And ever since then, I've been coming on the center's website just to find out who are going to be speaking during these events, and always go on to see if the PowerPoints have been uploaded and audio. So I think what you guys are doing is really great, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk here. And I also want to say hi to Dr. Halligan. I actually had a phone chat with him back in the spring of 2013 because I took this one credit course where I had to interview someone who had some experience participating in emergency management practice. And so I had a pretty good conversation with him to learn some about his experience working there in Pennsylvania. So with that being said, I'm going to start my talk here. This is really the research for my thesis, some of the background information. The title of the talk today will be called Children's Tornado Safety Education Acquisition, a Case Study of Oklahoma School District. And I'll talk about the outline here. I'll give an overview of the Moore, Oklahoma 2013 tornado. I'll talk about how this tornado impacted the schools and the surrounding community. Also, I'll talk about my purpose and motivation. When I came up with a thesis topic, I wanted to make sure I chose a topic that allowed me to have some applicability, not just creating esoteric knowledge. And I also talk about what I mean by tornado safety education. So I couldn't really find a term that really dealt with what I wanted to talk about, so I had to kind of come up with that term myself. And then also talk about the importance of disaster education, why we need it, and the impact that it can have on the community. And then I'll talk about literature review of disaster education. And here I'll talk about some of the various pedagogies or teaching methods. And also I'll talk about historical view of disaster education as it has been implemented in the U.S. public schools. And then finally I'll talk about my discussion of the Conceptual Framework, where I'll talk about disaster subculture and emergent literacy perspectives, and how in a disaster subculture, how that emergent literacy perspective can be utilized. And then I'll talk about my questionnaire briefly. Unfortunately, I don't have any data yet. I'm still in the process of collecting my data, but I'll give a brief overview of some of my questions and themes. And lastly, I have some discussion questions to foster a discussion, but I'm also open to other comments and discussion. So I think you guys have the visual, so if you guys can turn to the next slide. So on May 20, 2013, an EF5 tornado swept through Moore, Oklahoma. And in a 1990 book, Disasters by Design, Dennis Milletti, he reminds us that tornadoes occur in the U.S. more than any other country. And these tornadoes usually happen in the Midwest, Southwest areas. And on the morning of May 20th, there was a meteorologist, Rick Smith. He works for the National Weather Service, and actually went into his office on that morning of May 20th, and he realized that there was going to be a potential for a tornado outbreak in the morning. So at 8:05, he sent out this email, and I want to read it here. And I have to say that on May 19th, there also was a tornado. So here's what the email says. First of all, our thoughts and prayers go out to all those impacted by the tornadoes yesterday, and to all the first responders, emergency management, and relief agencies who are dealing with the aftermath. We're going to be dealing with more significant storms today, including the potential for tornadoes and giant hail. The risk for tornadoes will be highest along the south of I-44, including the OKC metro area. We expect storms to develop a little earlier than yesterday, maybe as soon as 1 to 2 p.m. This is going to create serious issues if we have tornadic storms in areas at school dismissal time and certainly during the afternoon drive. Please be sure that schools in your area are aware of the risk and that they start thinking about what they would do if there are warnings at these critical times today. We are sending damage survey teams out, but they're going to be challenged to complete their surveys before more storms develop. We will post our findings as soon as possible. We will hold our routine 10 a.m. conference call today as scheduled, and we'll dig into the weather a little later then. Let us know if any specific questions, comments, or concerns. And so I have to say that Oklahoma, they're fortunate to have the National Weather Service in their area, and they seem to have a pretty good relationship with various different stakeholders. So that preliminary warning was sent to over 380 officials in the government, hospital, and emergency management sectors. And so a little later at 2:40, Smith sent out an official warning when a tornado touched down in Newcastle area. And that tornado is swept through a moor, destroying numerous businesses such as an IMAX movie theater, also one of a major hospital in the area, and also 2 elementary schools in the Moore Public School Districts. And those schools are Plaza Towers Elementary and Briarwood Elementary School. And so there were various newspaper articles that showed how the teachers, they were really heroic in what they did following these storms. And Plaza Towers Elementary, one teacher in particular, Claire Gossett, she shielded her students in the hallway and then moved into the bathroom. Other teachers, they shielded their students with their own bodies or even freeze them into a closet. So unfortunately, these 2 schools that I mentioned that were destroyed, they didn't have any type of storm shelters. And the superintendent of the school district, Susan Pierce, at the time, she mentioned that Oklahoma State mandates that the schools have tornado drills at least 2 a year. And she mentioned that their schools really, follow these rules and they actually exceed these expectations. And I have to mention, I have up here the 1999 Moore tornado, because this school district, they're no stranger to tornadoes impacting their school. In 1999, a tornado impacted 2 schools, Kelly Elementary and also Westmore Elementary School. Unfortunately, these schools actually were let out for the day, so there were no fatalities. And when those 2 schools were rebuilt, they were rebuilt with safe rooms in them. And I have to say that picture on the right here is actually the EF5 tornado on May 20th as it approached one of the schools. And so someone took that picture. So I'll move to the next slide. So the purpose and motivation of the study, I have to say that actually I went to Moore 2 months after May 20th. So around July 22nd, I was in Moore for a week. And my main priority there was actually to kind of go door to door, a colleague and I, and we were proctoring a survey or questionnaire about how people responded to the tornado. And our first question was, what were you doing the moment that you received a tornado warning? And a lot of people told us that they were watching TV and they saw this tornado warning. And as soon as they heard the tornado warning, they decided to go get their children. There was a bit of fear that was kind of portrayed by parents and grandparents. They didn't want their children being home, walking from school in event of a tornado or on the bus. So they felt safer if they went to go get their child and they could bring them home and they could, go to a safe room in the home or underground shelter. And one mother in particular, she let me know that she wasn't familiar with any type of post-tornado policies. So she wasn't sure what to do, how to pick her child up after a tornado event. So hearing these narratives really piqued my interest to try to do a project that allowed me to look at tornado safety education. And so here I have the purpose of my study. And so the first bullet point here says to find out what are the current K through 12 tornado safety education practices in a district in Oklahoma. So I want to find out exactly how schools teach students how to protect themselves, and also the staff. You know, are there standalone courses or different ideas integrated into existing curriculum? Also, the second point is to investigate teachers' perceptions of children understanding and knowledge of tornado safety education. I had a questionnaire for kindergarten teachers, so I want to find out exactly how do they introduce students to tornado protective action when they enter school, and how do they kind of ease maybe children from being scared to talk about tornadoes, and then also how well do they understand what they're learning from the teachers. And then lastly there, just to assess the strengths and weaknesses of tornado safety education in a district in Oklahoma. And I just want to make sure, due to privacy issues, I won't be using the Moore Public School District as my case study. I'm going to be trying to locate a nearby school district to find out exactly how they responded to the tornado, and also what type of tornado safety education that they have. And my motivation here is to inform school and governmental officials about tornado safety education in order to create safer schools in a tornado event. And on the right there, you can see a picture that's actually a memorial at Plaza Towers Elementary. Again, 7 students died in that school and 1 teacher. And overall, there are about 24 fatalities. And you can see the 4 little blue cheers. And in the middle there's one kind of big cheer that's black, and that represents the teacher. And so I went to this memorial, and 2 months later, there were actually people still coming and leaving flowers or different T-shirts where they would sign their names. There also was an organization that was selling T-shirts, and all the money and the proceeds were going to help the school rebuild with a storm shelter. And I should say the 2 schools that are being rebuilt, they will have storm shelters. So I'll move to the next slide. And so I came out with this idea of tornado safety education. Unfortunately, there weren't too many people that were doing research on disaster education. A lot of my research came from international scholars such as David Johnson and Kevin Ronan. Those are 2 scholars from New Zealand. They did a lot on disaster education. In a recent article, they wrote that disaster education includes 2 components. One component is to discuss disaster risk, and also methods to reduce injuries and damage. And so when I was coming up with my definition of tornado safety education, I wanted people to know that I wasn't talking so much about the science of tornadoes, even though that can be a component of it, but I more was interested in the protective action. So I define tornado safety education as any training, activity, curriculum, or instruction that teaches information about tornado risk and techniques to decrease harm. And so an example of tornado education, if you can see the picture there, it's a tornado drill in Wisconsin. So that's like a pretty familiar procedure for schools that are at threat to tornadoes, where they'll go into a hallway that's kind of interior of the school, and they'll kind of put their heads against the wall and cover their heads with their hands. And so you can see in the forefront there, little girl kind of like in a pinkish shirt, her hands aren't covered her head, so her head will be exposed there. So luckily this is only a drill. So I'll move to the next slide here. And so the importance of disaster education. Over the past 25 years, there have been numerous disaster events that have occurred while students were in school. For example, in Armenia in 1988, there was an earthquake that actually killed over 285 students out of around 300 students in one particular school. And also in China in 2008, the Sichuan earthquake, there were thousands of students that died and schools that were destroyed. Now, some of this may have been done due to shoddy building materials, but the importance of education is to make sure that students have the knowledge to protect themselves when the event occurs, so that they'll know exactly what to do. And also, schools can provide formal disaster education. As I mentioned, Ronan and Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, they are from New Zealand, and so they mentioned that, so that's a pretty much developed country, and they say that, at one point in time, all people really are in school, and so this is a good way to introduce people to disaster education. And there's some geographers, Vitek and Berta, and they wrote an article that disaster education should be mandatory in schools K through 12, because without this education, people will acquire very few accurate perceptions of natural hazards. And also, children can potentially serve as disaster conduits. So this is the idea that people can, and children in particular, that they can take what they learn at school and bring it home and share it with their family. Ronan and Johnson, they did some research in 2003, and it talked about how children in this one New Zealand school, that they learn things about earthquakes and they actually do take it home and share it with their parents. And the parents also admitted that the students, because the parents, they were also surveyed, that they did make some earthquake hazard adjustments due to the information that their children shared with them. And also, when we think about vulnerabilities and disasters, children, they are also one group that's normally targeted, and also women and children are normally coupled. And so children, they kind of rely on adults in disaster situations. So that's one of their vulnerabilities. And also, at one time, Anderson, he wrote an article. He mentioned that children, we really haven't spent too much time talking about children in disasters, and that's kind of due to some early beliefs that children really weren't impacted by disasters, that it really never caused them any trauma because they were too young to really understand what was happening in the disasters. So I think education can be used as a way to decrease vulnerabilities for children. If they know what to do in a disaster, they may have to rely on adults a little less frequently. And the image there is just a student looking at a school that has been destroyed in a disaster. And so I will move to the next slide, where I talk about disaster education literature review. And Shaw et al. 2011, they actually mentioned various different forms of disaster education. And one is formal education. We think about formal education as your traditional K through 12 or college students are normally age 5 to 12, where they're progressing on an educational ladder, and their specific learning objectives and around a specific time frame. Second, he says another type of education is non-formal. And non-formal education, anyone, any age can participate in this type of education. It can be in a school setting or outside of school setting. When you think about programs such as adult literacy or work skills, those types of education are non-formal. And the last type of education is informal. And informal education is when you're at home and you're just, or with friends or family, and learning opportunities arise out of those different conversations and activities. And Petal and his colleague in 2008, they talked about how disaster education can be delivered. And so schools, they can create a standalone course where you're teaching students about disaster education, or you can infuse another type of way to teach, infuse the existing curriculum with disaster education theories and concepts, or also about integration, and that's where you create sections of disaster concepts and theories that can be just added to existing curriculum. Another scholar who talks about various pedagogies or teaching methods is John Preston. He's a scholar from London, and he talks about various pedagogies. I'll talk about three different ones. One is effective pedagogy, and this deals with more of an emotional response instead of teaching more about the cognitive. He gives an example of in the 1950s during the Cold War, there was a film that was shown in various schools called Let's Face It. And this film actually told people not to be really passive about atomic bombs, but to be more proactive and to have a more positive response. He also talks about didactic and banking pedagogies, and this is the idea that you don't really refer to this literature unless there is an emergency. He gives an example of people being on an airplane where you may listen to a flight attendant briefly talk about how to use your oxygen mask, but in the event that you need to use your oxygen mask, if there's like an emergency landing for a emergency plane landing, you know that that literature exists. You know that you have a card near your seat where you can look at the instructions on how to put your mask on in the event of an emergency to receive oxygen. And the last pedagogy that I talk about is the rehearsal. And this is something like during a tornado drill, where people who will be in an emergency situation, they'll actually rehearse what to do in an emergency. And this rehearsal can be beneficial because it really removes the fear from people, especially students, that they would have an emergency situation. Also, rehearsal pedagogy allows for those involved to assess what's going on to see if any changes need to be made. And the third point here is I'm going to talk about this 1851 false alarm. It was in a book by Galloway. He was a historian, and he wrote a book really on the history of the FDNY. And he talked about how in 1851 there was this false alarm fire in a school in New York in Greenwich Village. There was a teacher who felt lightheaded, and some of her students, they rushed out of the classroom into an auditorium filled with students. And the students that were in the auditorium heard these two students screaming, "Water, water." So they actually thought there was a fire, and that created mass chaos and panic. So hundreds of students rushed out of this auditorium to the nearest exit to try to escape. But the doors, they were locked, so the students couldn't get out. So all these students, they were in front of the at the front entrance trying to get out. And the police department in New York, they were trying to get in. But at the school building, the doors opened inwards. So the fire department, they were trying to get in, but they couldn't because it was hundreds of people standing in front of the door. And eventually, the fire department, they were able to get in, find out that 40 students died due to being trampled or suffocation. And so this event really served as a focus event. It showed schools that they really weren't prepared to deal with emergencies such as a fire, and students really didn't know how to respond in the event of a fire. And so teachers around the world, or around the nation, heard about this story, and so they took it upon themselves to start doing these fire drills. And it wasn't actually until a few more fires that schools in New York started to mandate that schools conduct fire drills in 1901. And also I should highlight that this 1851 false alarm fire, that really set a precedent for doors in public places to open outward instead of inward. And so fast forward about 50 years later, there was this idea that a school in the U.S. would be attacked by the Russians, and that they would be attacked with an atomic bomb. So the SCDA, along with the DOE, they produced a series of films. One popular one was called Duck and Cover, and this film really shows students how to protect themselves if an atomic bomb occurred. And so I think we'll have video, and those who can have access to the video, we're going to play just a short 4-minute clip of this. If people don't have a video, I guess they can hear the audio, so we can play that.
Zephi, there might have been a breakdown here. We don't have the video. However, all the students that are online have seen this video because I show it to them in 601, which is our first class that they take.
Oh, okay, all right, also no problem. All right, so I'll continue. So thank you. So this film was shown to students all over the U.S. So if you have a grandparent or a parent who was in schools in the 1950s, they saw this film, Duck and Cover. And it really just shows and highlights Bert the turtle really kind of going under a desk and taking protective action. And I should say that we know that an atomic bomb going under your table that really wouldn't help. And so, but that was really kind of a strategy to really try to prepare schools for atomic bombs. And historian Joanne Brown wrote an article, and she said that teachers really embrace learning about the civil defense strategy because it showed teachers their nationalism, and it also showed the importance of schools really as a way to bolster national security. And it's argued that the current tornado earthquake drills, they really developed out of this duck and cover practices that were created in the 1950s. And I also have to mention there were other films that created, such as Atomic Alert. In that film, it shows students really kind of partnering with parents to protect themselves in the event of an atomic bomb. But also in these films, you see civil defense workers really coming to the scene really to restore order after the atomic bomb. And the last bullet point here, so I found some current tornado safety education practices in Oklahoma. And so the schools have to do tornado drills at least 2 a year. One has to be in the first week of the school year. And also, I found some information about how, the state doesn't really require specifics of tornado plans, but every school does have to have a tornado plan. I have seen one school's tornado plan, and what I found was most plans, it just kind of shows that, if we receive a tornado warning, a lot of times the warning will come, over the buzzer, and that, students know that's a tornado warning and we need to take protective action. And a lot of times the warning just says that students have to go to their designated area if the school has a safe room. And so that was pretty much it. So the schools have to have the plan, but the state doesn't require them to have specifics. And so I'll move to the next slide. Which is my conceptual framework. And I wanted to talk about disaster subculture, but before then, I have to mention disaster culture, and this was actually published in a book by Harry Estill Moore in 1964. And I should say this conceptual framework is really going to frame my thesis ideas. I'm going to be talking about disaster subculture in the emergency literacy perspective. So in 1964, Moore, he wrote this book, In the Wind Blows, and he talks about how in a place like the Gulf Coast, that people in these areas, they really create coping mechanisms to deal with frequent threats. In addition, that these people, they really have a sense of pride in being able to face disasters. The idea is that, we can, handle ourselves in the event of a tornado. So, for example, he interviewed people in the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Carla, and he mentioned that a lot of elderly people, they refuse to evacuate because in their lives they've never evacuated before, and also their homes had made it through disasters or hurricane events in the past, so they didn't see the need to evacuate. So overall, in these disaster cultures, people really create mechanisms to adjust and to prevent the danger and the hazard from impacting their lives. So following Moore's early concept of disaster subculture, there were some other people in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Anderson and Winger and Weller, they expanded in Moore's concept and they referred to it as a disaster subculture. And I should say that Anderson, he mentioned just because a community has a frequent threat, it doesn't mean that they have a disaster subculture, but that they have to see the disaster as really being continuous and having an impact on the community where they will want to make and create mechanisms to deal with that disaster event. Now, I'll talk about Winger and Weller because they talked about specific elements of a disaster subculture, how one developed. And they mentioned that first you have to have a repetitive threat. So it has to be something recurring, and the community, they see this as a need that needs to be addressed. Second, there has to be a forewarning. And so we know events like tornadoes, and that there is a warning for those events. Earthquakes, we know there's no warning for them, although there was some research done in the 70s that people in California, specifically in the San Fernando Valley, that they said that when earthquakes occur, that sometimes that people, they can kind of, they see like earthquake weather, or their animals start acting kind of weird. But we know that in a tornado event that there are warnings. And this warning time, it allows for people to make the adjustments to minimize the threat of the disaster. And also, Winger and Weller, they mentioned that in a disaster subculture, you can have an individualistic component or organizational component. At the individual level, people know how to protect themselves and how to minimize the threat. At the organizational level, it becomes the responsibility of organizations to respond to the disaster event. For example, Anderson, in his 1965 article, he mentioned how in Cincinnati that experienced floods, that there was a big organizational disaster component to their disaster subculture. Organizations such as the Red Cross or police department or public works, they responded to floods. And also in these disaster subcultures, there's a component of socialization. Winger and Weller, they outline how in flood towns, the community, they really socialize newcomers how to protect themselves in the event of a flood. For example, in some areas in Ohio, that they know if their basement is going to be flooded, they'll fill it with fresh water to prevent the water from outside to fill their basements up. And so they also would have maybe a flood seminar that can be kind of ran by organizations, just to let people know what's going on in regards to floods. And we also know that in disaster subcultures, there's been some international research that has been done, and students in particular, they mentioned that they learn more about disaster events. For one article talked about cyclones, and they asked students, how do you learn about cyclones? And most of the students mentioned that they learned about cyclones due to the information that they learned from their family or the media. So in these disaster subcultures, the family as a social agent is also very important. And also I should mention how after that 1999 Moore, Oklahoma tornado, it showed how after that tornado, it showed some scholars, they did a research project. It was an informal survey where they interviewed people who were in middle school or junior high school in Oklahoma. And in that tornado, there was an absence of deaths between people who were 5 and 23 years old. So one of the explanations is due to the fact that students in the more public school districts, that they learned about tornadoes at school. And so when the tornado happened, they were home and they were able to take safety precautions. And about 80% of that people who were surveyed, they took protective action in a place that the National Weather Service recommends. So in a disaster subculture, we have organizations, we have families who really, and schools who really can teach and instruct students how to protect themselves in the event of a disaster. And so I couple disaster subculture with this concept called emergent literacy perspective. And this was a concept that was out in the 1980s by Till and Salisbury. And they mentioned how at one point in time, there was this train of thought that students didn't learn literacy skills, how to read, how to write, until they entered into a formal institution, such as a school. Now, Till and Salisbury, they reject that claim. They say that due to the fact that literacy is a part of American culture, that students are accumulating these literacy skills such as reading and writing before they enter school. So we shouldn't ignore that 0 to 6 years old, because those are really important formative years where people and kids can acquire these skills. So, and they use emergent because they said there's not one point in time where students become literate. Instead, it's more of a process, and they're learning something new, and it's developing, it's emerging. So I argue that more is a disaster subculture, and so I'm using the ideas from Wiener and Weller, how to develop a disaster subculture. Since 1875, the National Weather Service has kept account of tornadoes, and so in Moore area, there has been around 22 tornadoes that have ranged between a EF5, EF0 and EF5. Also, the second element, if you remember, there has to be a forewarning. And we definitely have tornado warnings. In the 1950s, technology advanced so that we could predict tornadoes, and that these tornadoes, that they would be kind of broadcast over the television or TV. In the 1970s, also another type of warning was implemented. There were sirens. Also in the late 1970s, there was a push to make the NOAA weather radios available to households so that they could gather information on their own. And now today, with technology, people can go on the internet and get a tornado warning, or even have a warning sent to their phone. And so, how do I apply the emergent literacy perspective to a disaster subculture? I talk about how, in a disaster subculture, I'm making the prediction, and hopefully I'll collect my data to see if this is true, but I'm making the prediction that students in a disaster subculture, such as Moore, where tornadoes happen frequently, that they will learn about tornadoes before they enter into a formal education. Compared to a place such as Delaware, we don't really have tornadoes. So I can't imagine that a parent is at home telling their students or children how to prepare for a tornado, or even doing any type of tornado drills. And so in a place where there's a disaster subculture or a tornado disaster subculture, I think that parents are going to talk about tornadoes with their children, and when their students go to school, they're going to learn more information about tornadoes, and as a result, they're going to, their tornado safety education literacy is going to progress, is going to also reinforce what they already know. And I also would hope that as a child matriculates from elementary to middle school to high school, that they're learning more information, that the curriculum and the content of tornado safety education is advancing. And so on the right there's just a picture that we took when we were in Moore, Oklahoma. That's just a house that was destroyed after the EF5 tornado swept through. So I will move to my 8th slide. And so I have a questionnaire that I'm developing. I'm actually trying to get these questionnaires sent out to school district that's in the Moore area, so I can interview administrators and teachers in the school district. And so the principals, there's 2 different questionnaires. The principals questionnaire is actually comprised of open-ended and short-ended questions. And so there's really 3 themes in this questionnaire. One, the impact, response, and plans. So I want to find out how the school was impacted by the May 20th tornado, if at all. Also, I want to talk about the response. How did the schools respond? How were they alerted that a tornado was happening? And also, I want to talk about their plans, because sometimes we know that when a disaster happens, I want to find out how effective was the plan in the school district, and also has the school district made any type of plans, additional plans? Have they altered their plans since the May 20th tornado? And also, I want to, the second theme there is curriculum components. I want to find out exactly how schools teach students about tornadoes, students and staff. And then also, I have a third theme here beyond students and staff education. I want to find out, in a place in Oklahoma, in Moore area, do schools really take it as their responsibility to teach students, teach community members about tornadoes, or do they feel like it's not their responsibility? And then so I want to interview whatever school district I do my research in. I just want to survey one administrator in each school, and then also I want to have a questionnaire for teachers, kindergarten teachers in particular, just one kindergarten teacher from each school, and I have a questionnaire for them. It's 10 questions, and they're all open-ended. But in their survey, I want to find out, do kindergarten students know about tornado protective action before they enter school? What do teachers teach students about tornadoes? And how well do they understand the information that they are provided? So I am in the process of trying to get a school district to participate in this research. What I'm finding out is that a lot of school districts have a lot of research already going on, so it's kind of tough to get access to students, to staff, because they did have a lot going on, and with state testing, and so a lot of times the staff really, they don't want to be bothered with additional work. So my fingers are crossed that there will be some school district who will want to participate in this research, because I think it would be really valuable if I can collect this data and share it with the school district that I use, but also other school districts that are prone to tornadoes, so that we can create safer schools and to protect students and staff in the event of a tornado. And so with that being said, I'm going to move to the last slide, and I'm open up to other questions, and I came up with a few questions. I didn't know if people wanted to create a dialogue. But with that being said, I'm going to stop here, and we can have a chat, discuss these questions, or if people have other questions, I am more than happy to answer them or entertain any comments as well. Thank you all for your time.
All right, we'll open it up if anybody has any questions. We'll facilitate from there. And Zephi, you said you had some other things you wanted to talk about if there weren't questions?
Yeah, so on the last slide there, I have questions there that I could answer myself, or someone in the, on the chat if they would want to pitch in, and I would love to hear your ideas as well. So, for example, the first question that I have on the last slide there is, do you think in a tornado disaster subculture, kindergarten students will know about tornado protective actions before they enter school? Why or why not?
Dan, did you have a question?
I was going to interject here. I saw that first question. I think it all has to do with, similar to what Dan was writing in the chat, did their parents teach them? Were they through a tornado once before? Was another family member through a tornado? If they aren't familiar with it, especially at that age, they may not have had to deal with that. So I think maybe in the school is a good way to start to get everyone on the same page.
Yeah, so I think that's really important. If the person, if the parent in particular, if they've experienced tornadoes in their past, I think that they will be more familiar with tornadoes, and as a result, they will want to talk to their child about tornado protective action compared to someone who may, for example, may not be from Moore, Oklahoma, who maybe just kind of a transplant, who maybe really never dealt with any tornadoes. Maybe they will rely more on the school to teach students about tornadoes. And so I think it really depends a lot on the parent. So I'm really going to be interested to find out what teachers say about my question, because I think the question on their survey is just, what do kindergarten students already know about tornado protective action before they enter school? So I really wish I had the data to say, if the students know or not. So hopefully, when I get my data collected, I can share this information with you guys, through email. But it's going to be really interesting to see. And I also have a question, should schools be responsible, and this is something that I'm thinking about myself, for educating the broader community about tornado protective action? And so, we see schools as really being a big part of communities and being able to use their knowledge and resources to share with parents or community members about tornadoes. And so some people may say, well, you know what, I don't think that schools should be responsible for educating, their neighbors and community members. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I would love to hear what you guys
like to chime in here, because this is something that I've been working on for a while also, and not strictly with tornadoes, just strictly with preparedness from the school-age children concept. In fact, I just wrote something recently for a book on game theory and preparedness, and my idea of all this is kind of twofold. One, if you're in that area, and as you say in your first comment there, the parents understand and they do a good job of teaching the child good habits, I think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, I think what we see a lot of times is, for instance, fire safety or fire prevention. Here's the third grader in school, and they learn how to do an exit drill in the house, and they learn, and they draw their house, and they draw it, and they're told to go home and practice their plan, and they get home and the parents don't want to practice. And I think that's where our system falls out sometimes. To go to the bigger picture, I think that preparedness in general, if we can prepare children in elementary school, so they're not, no matter what the disaster is, they can be prepared. I think that's a good thing. And I think there are things that the teachers can do, small drills, exercises, practices. Something that I wrote for this book was a concept where, people die because they're creatures of habit. And for instance, the station nightclub fire, where everybody tried to go out the entrance, and they died when there were 6 exits that nobody used. So, something as simple as a teacher saying, you know what, instead of going left today like we do every time we leave our classroom, let's go right today. And, and try and break some of the bad habits and create some good habits. And I think that your research here, albeit you're focused on tornadoes, can be bigger than just tornadoes, obviously, in the educational process. So I'll jump off my high horse now and see if anybody else wants to chime in.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Those are some good thoughts there.
I'd like to mention something too. While you were going through this, thinking of the all hazards approach side of things, obviously this is focused on the tornado using research from the tornado and what people have learned from it. But it kind of makes me wonder that maybe there should be a day, in the spring and in the fall, in each school, in each grade level, where you go through this, that this becomes such a second nature type thing. It's a real world rather than, sticking with the curriculum of the day for each class. You have this real world experience of where, and more they learn mostly about tornadoes, but also they're learning about fires, flooding, and some other information, and that happens from kindergarten through 12th grade. So, even when they get out, they're a well-informed adult and they're aware of how to deal with these options and how to stay safe.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I know in some international countries they have something called, a disaster day, where students do have these activities, one day a year where they're doing educational activities where they're learning about disasters. So I'll be all for that, creating a disaster day where schools throughout the U.S., really are learning about disaster events and how to protect themselves. And I think that would be a great idea. That's something that maybe disaster scholars can maybe try to, really pitch ideas to various different educational officials. So I'll be all down for, a day like that. So that's definitely a good idea. And so just my last discussion question that I want to give here is, how would you respond to the comment, education isn't enough to protect people in the event of a tornado? Or we can talk about any disaster event. How would you respond to that comment, if anyone has any thoughts on that? Because I can imagine that in a school district that they may be facing kind of financial issues, and they may not want to use money on creating a tornado safety education curriculum. Instead, they may want to kind of use that money to maybe build a safe room, or maybe the government officials, they would rather use their money to help create better tornado weather forecasting. So if any thoughts on that question?
I think from my perspective, while others are thinking of their answers, there's a difference between education and training. I think we educate people, we teach people, and they have their rote memory and et cetera, but just educating people isn't enough. They still have to have that training component. And I'll use a real world example, Ebola. People were educated on how to wear their protective gear and their personal protective equipment, and yet we have 2 nurses that potentially did not do it correctly because they were maybe educated but not properly trained, or they didn't take their training seriously. So maybe not exactly what you're talking about, but I think that it has to be from my perspective the whole 9 yards. We need to educate, we need to train, we need to practice properly. So that's my 2 cents. Let's see if anybody else has anything.
Yeah, I think training is definitely a part of that, also being coupled with education. But I also, I think that, in a place where there's going to be a tornado, I want the schools to also have, a safe room or some type of storm shelter, because you could tell people, educate them, but if the building is not safe, there's only so much you can do to protect yourself. If a EF5, comes through. So I think that schools really should start looking at ways to install safe rooms. I think it should be really mandatory, especially in a place like Oklahoma, that these schools have safe rooms. Fortunately, that the 2 schools that were destroyed, the new schools, they will have storm shelters. So I know we have about 6 more minutes. So if there's any more comments or questions?
Well, while they're thinking, I'll go towards your point that we've talked about this a lot in the last week or 2 in some of my classes, and I agree with you 100%. I find it completely appalling that we are a nation of such wealth, and yet we don't have safe rooms in in places that need safe rooms, and various. I mean, the technology is out there to keep most people safe from most disasters, but yet we spend money on ludicrous things and not on preparedness and things that we could easily spend money on. So I agree with you 100%. Jeff, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion. I wasn't there for this particular event, but there was a tornado that ripped through Enterprise schools in Alabama, and I know that after that, I think legislation was made that every school had to have a safe room built in it because the kids were in the most safe place that they would have taken anyone. I think there's some documentaries on it involving, they put the kids in the middle hallway up against the wall, and just the way the buildings were built. I mean, the walls tumbled on them. I think there were 8 lives lost that day, and that sparked, of course, a desire to keep the children safe. I mean, that tornado literally was on a path, went right through the center of that school, and took out where their designated safe place was, and that was enough to push everyone across the state to have to push in shelters for tornadoes.
Yeah, it's such a shame that, someone has to die, for, schools to decide that they need storm shelters, because I really think they should be in the schools, and especially, Tornado Alley, that every school should have one, because, a tornado can strike any time of the day. Fortunately, we don't hear about too many tornadoes actually striking, or serious, I should say, tornadoes striking schools, but it really can happen any time in the day. So I really think that definitely every new school should have a tornado shelter, and it's definitely a money thing, because I think that I read somewhere, storm shelters for schools, they cost $1 million, and so with school districts and state governments struggling financially, I think it's definitely a burden on them, but I definitely think it's going to be very beneficial to have them, and I think lives are a lot more important than the $1 million to kind of install these safe rooms. So I really hope that schools around the nation will start implementing these storm shelters.
I'm also finding too, part of the discussion that we ended up hearing, after that, some of the schools didn't, or take a little bit of time, and some of them even have storm shelters, but now schools are so afraid of the liability that now they're making these decisions, a tornado watch is out at 10 o'clock in the morning, well, we're going to dismiss our students at noon to go home, and then all of a sudden at 12:30, 1 o'clock, you have tornadoes on the ground, and there's all these buses sending kids to homes that don't have safe places in the state. So it's interesting to see the after effects where these schools just don't want, they may be the safest place to be for these kids, and now these kids are home without family members, without parents, which just further complicates the need for people to be educated on what to do, and including the administrators making those decisions.
Yeah, so one good thing about Moore, Oklahoma, a lot of people actually had storm shelters, underground storm shelters that we encountered. And so, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, a lot of people went to go get their child from school. And I think it was that they felt like that their child would be more safe at home. And also, if someone didn't have a storm shelter, they actually had access to their neighbor's storm shelter. I remember one person in particular, they told me how they had a key to their neighbor's storm shelter. And we really see, I saw really a sense of community. If the storm was coming, people would say, I know you don't have a storm shelter, well, come on over and get in my storm shelter. Because the news anchor on one of the local stations, he told people, if you're not underground, you will die. People actually, if they didn't have a storm shelter, some people actually tried to outrun the storm shelter, but most people actually had a storm shelter or had access to a neighbor or family member storm shelter. And I also heard this wonderful kind of anecdotal story. This one lady told me that a lot of times storm shelters are on the front lawn. So if a passerby, is on the road during a tornado, they can actually kind of, get into the storm shelter themselves and take protective action. So yeah, I think, and more in that area, it was good idea that people had storm shelters. And those are a few $1,000s, but I think at one point there was a lottery that was financing people to implement these storm shelters. And so some people, they were able to use those resources from the lottery to have the storm shelter.
All right, I think I don't see any more questions. I can tell you that this was probably one of the more informative sessions we've had in a while, from the standpoint that obviously interaction here. Great conversation. Appreciate it very much. Keep us in mind if you do continued research and want to come back and visit us again so we can keep this going.
Thank you. Yes, I will update you guys, because I know when I originally decided and you guys allowed me to give this presentation, I really wish I had my data to back up my ideas here. So when I get the data, I'll share it with you all. And yeah, so I'm really fortunate to have this opportunity, and I'm glad that you guys do these talks because they really are informative. And so I was glad to be a part of this seminar.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody else, for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Thank you. Have a great day.